So my name is Pete Denny. I'm the founder of a climate VC firm called Climate VC. And our mission is to try and have a gigaton scale impact on the climate emergency. We've been running for about 2 years now. We've made 14 investments. And this is my mission actually for the rest of my career. I'm kind of hoping that my kids will get involved as well. So what we're going to do over the next hour is to talk about why we think innovation is so important in speeding up the climate transition, to talk about the role of venture capital in that. And then I've brought along a couple of founders to speak to us as well about how their companies, there's a whole breadth of things happening in this space, but how their companies are helping with the transition. And then we'll finish off with listening to Richard talk about the strategic side of things. How does that sound? Yeah, should we do that? Great.
Yeah.
Great. So a bit about me first. So I'm like probably many of the people in this room, a programmer by trade. I started programming computers when I was 10 years old with the ZX81. Any other ZX81 specialists out there? Yes. Great, good stuff. The Spectrum, the Amiga, I've programmed in BASIC, Java, Python, Scala, all of those kinds of things, and spent a lot of my life building large systems out of technology and people. In hedge funds and so on. I made my first company in Paris in the 90s in the dot-com boom when everybody was creating their own company. I've been in and out of large tech consultancies, Sun Microsystems and so on. And one of the things I did most recently was I specialized in AI, and we built the world's first robo-advisor in the pension space using a deep learning model, which we thought was terribly clever, but ended up solving the wrong problem. I don't know whether you've ever had that experience. You build this amazing product and it solves the wrong problem. I then went back to consultancy where I was looking at how can we use the tools of machine learning, deep learning and things like that to solve interesting problems. And one interesting problem that I came along was how do we find the hidden sources of funding for deforestation? Right, so trees are being cut down in Indonesia. Who's paying for those chainsaws? And why are they doing that? And do they know they're doing it? And so we built this very large system that was that brought together lots of data sets in kind of the way that the Panama Papers was discovered. That those findings were discovered. And during those 9 months, I spent 9 months with my nose pressed up against climate change every day. And that's when I thought, I think I need to stop messing about with just having fun, building interesting things with technology, and see what I can do to spend the rest of my life fighting climate change. So I shut down the consultancy that I was running at that time and took 6 months off to explore, because I thought, I'm not a climate scientist. I don't really know what I can bring to the table. This is my age, this is my background, these are my weaknesses, these are my strengths. What can I bring to the table? And I wondered about starting a startup myself, doing another startup. I wondered, could I build... I heard somebody say in a conference one time, if you're going to do something about climate change, you've got to shoot for a gigaton scale impact. So I thought, okay, that sounds good. I don't know how big that is, but it sounds big. Let me go for that. So I looked at what can you do about, could you build a rainforest in the desert? Hey, why don't we turn the Sahara Desert, that's not doing anything. Why don't we turn that into a rainforest? So I spent a couple of weeks on that and realized you could do that. But you probably shouldn't do that, because I could devote the next 15 years to doing that, and at the same time, the amount of forest that you could recreate would be getting chopped down all of the time. In the rainforests of Indonesia, Guatemala, Brazil, places like that. Okay, so let's go and try and solve that problem. Why are people chopping down trees? And you realize quite quickly, wow, it's for complex reasons. Actually, it's not as easy as saying, right, everybody, let's stop eating palm oil. It's not as easy as that. Once you start lifting the lid on this, it gets complicated quite quickly, and it gets really down to the root of everything that it means to be human. Why is there climate change? It's because of everything it means to be human, and the solutions to that require changes in all of the areas that are affected by what it means to be human. So we need to change everything. We need to change the way we grow food. We need to change what we wear. We need to change how we build things. We need to choose whether we move around. If we move around, how we move around, how we generate energy, all of those things. So I thought, I spent 6 months interviewing people, trying things out and reading things. And that's when I discovered there are many, many people in the UK who know what needs to be done, who have ideas about how to solve that, but who are just not getting that first leg up on the ladder, who are finding it difficult to go from 0 to 1. So I thought, maybe that's where I can show up. I understand a little bit about how money works. I understand quite a bit about how startups work, having worked in a few, having done a few myself. I thought I'll do an early stage venture fund. That was about 2 years ago. I had to go learn how to do it. That took about a year. This is during COVID, if you remember that. I had to go get signed off from the FCA. That took about 10 months. And so about a year ago, 14 months ago, we launched an early stage venture fund to try and find people who they've got the amazing ideas that they might fail. They're quite risky, but if they don't fail, they could really have a meaningful impact on the climate emergency. So we've kind of set up this this strategy to look for companies that have that we believe have got a clear chance of getting to a 10 megaton scale impact every year. And my rough calculations on the back of a packet of cigarettes say that if you were to find 10 companies that make it all the way to where they want to get to, 10 megatons a year, and they do that every year for 10 years, and 10 companies, 10 years, 10 megatons, that's my gigaton. Okay, then I can retire, and that will probably take me longer than the rest of my career, but that was the idea. So why innovation? I'm sure Rich is going to go into more detail on this in his talk, but it's can't we just keep turning the handle of the technologies that we already have? Right, wind is doing really well. Right, it's sometimes you look at, I've got an app on my phone, Grid Carbon, I think it's called. It's all right, I'll try to remember it. That tells you what is the energy mix in the UK today. So how much of it is coming from coal, how much of it is coming from gas, how much of it is coming from wind, how much of it is coming from Norway, how much of it is coming from nuclear. And some days it's mainly wind and solar. You know, on days like yesterday, it's mainly wind and solar. So, you know, why not just push more into areas like that? Well, if we go back to what we said earlier, changing the energy mix is necessary, but it's not sufficient, because if you look at what are the causes of climate change, they're everything about what it means to be human. So we need the innovations that we've had in the energy sector, in wind and solar and EVs, the kind of transition that we've seen in the vehicle space. We need those same transitions across all of those other sectors: agriculture, the built environment, material science, and a lot of these. Although I believe that same effect, the Tesla effect, I call it, where you've got now you've got a path to make your transition from something which is very pollutant to something which is not pollutant. Now that we've got a path, it's easy for the government to institute new regulation. So the regulation, no new internal combustion engines in the UK anymore. That could only be possible because there was an attractive place for people to go. And that was only possible because a startup somewhere, a little bold, crazy startup, where the founder put all of his money into it and he was almost made himself bankrupt. They made a product that people wanted, that people then copied, that was then available in many countries. So, you know, I can, when it comes out, I want to buy one of those Volkswagen camper vans that's electric. That can only really exist because somebody else showed that it could be done. So that path from kind of zero to world adoption, I believe that Tesla effect is going to happen in all of these different verticals, and that's what kind of we're trying to have some small assistance in. So what we've done today is brought along a couple of companies that we've invested in. These are companies that we believe have got a clear path to 10 megatons of impact per year, and they're in. If you look at our portfolio, they're in very, very different areas. Some of them are in clean energy. One of the companies that we've invested in makes energy out of the heat that's trapped in seawater. Another one of our companies makes net zero, or actually carbon negative, food ingredients. So the flour in the bread that you ate on your egg on toast this morning, that emits CO2 into the atmosphere. So we found a company where they make an alternative to wheat flour that is made from a bread nut that grows in the forests of Guatemala and Mexico. And so now they're scaling up to supply companies like Unilever with flour alternatives, where the trees that these nuts grow on actually suck CO2 out of the air into the leaves, like all trees do, but then the root system mineralizes that CO2 into stone. right? So stones last for a long time, right? So that CO2 lasts for a long time. So my point there is that all of our portfolio companies are very different, and the two that we've got lined up today, one is in the insurance space, one is in the steel space, and I'd like to now hand the mic over to the philosophical mic, over to Osas from Deep Meta. Thanks a lot.
Good evening, everyone. I would like to start off by saying that steel is amazing. We live in a world that is built on steel. It is such an incredibly convenient material. Not only is it very versatile and can be used in a wide variety of applications, from infrastructure, as you can see, it shapes the cityscape. It also we also use it for our transportation. It is not only versatile, it's incredibly abundant and cheap. And so we use it in droves. Today, we use 1.8 billion tons of steel. And by 2050, this is going to increase. However, our appetite for this incredible material is having an adverse effect on our environment. And this is because for every ton of steel made, there are about 2 tons of CO2 that are produced. So that means that there is an incumbent responsibility on humankind to produce this critical material in a more sustainable fashion. I am Osas. I am the founder of Deep Meta, and Deep Meta is AI for circular metals production. My background is in material science. I did my PhD in steel metallurgy at Imperial College London. And during that time, I was sponsored by one of the largest steel producers in the UK. And that gave me the opportunity to work in their labs and also on their production lines. And I had some insight into how they solve problems. And it turns out it's quite traditional, despite the fact that they actually generate a lot of data. And therein lies something I think is quite interesting. The industry knows that they are very polluting. And so they are on this transition from a carbon-based economy, a carbon-based system, to one that's based around hydrogen. Today, the price of carbon is around $100 a ton, which is probably the most expensive it's been in mankind's history. On the other hand, green hydrogen is incredibly expensive. While this is going to be a very meaningful, necessary transition, it still means that we have to be very wise and very prudent about how we actually use energy. And that's where circularity comes in. So the steel industry is really good when it comes to recycling. In fact, steel is the most recycled material in the world. Reduction, however, is going to be incredibly important. And that means doing more with less. And that is where Deep Meta's current focus is. In the future, we want to go into reuse, which is talking about repurposing of steel, which is something I'll touch on at the end. So when it comes to the piece around reduction, this is a steel plant, and these are rolling mills. Each of these are stands. It's a very well instrumented process, and what that means is that it has many sensors fitted to it, which allows it to measure and record information. This is useful because then people can go back and figure out if something went wrong. Somebody who I know that started his career in the steel industry in the 1990s remembers trying to solve a problem with a defective piece of steel, wanting to discover what had gone wrong in the data to look for clues. He walked into an archive room and pulled out reams of paper, and he plodded through all of them to figure out, which zero wasn't there when it should have been. Now, that isn't super efficient. So although they were collecting all of this data, the way that they were collecting it wasn't great. They have moved on from that, and now this information is collected in a digital fashion. However, the data that they are collecting is typically used in that same format, in isolation, to solve singular problems. This prevents them from looking at their problem case from a much wider scope to look for otherwise not so easy to identify problems. And that's where the big data piece comes in. Now, in regards to that particular process in the rolling mill, despite the fact that they are gathering all this data, they are still wasting around, in an average mill, around 30,000 tons of steel a year, just because it's not optimized as it could be. One bit of the production line, which actually is just before the rolling mill I showed you, is called the reheat furnace. And it's a particular area of interest for us at Deep Meta. It's an area of interest because it's one of the most energy intensive parts of production. An average mill that operates a reheat furnace, and like the ones that we work with, they spend on average, in terms of their energy consumption, around 12 gigawatt hours per month. That's a huge amount of energy. And the amount of CO2 just from the reheat furnaces every month is around 2,000 tons. Now, what Deep Meta is doing to be able to help these people transition from being less sustainable to being more sustainable, leveraging the data that they're already generating, is by taking some factors that are well known. So we take information about the thermal capacity of their furnaces, about the positions of their furnaces, various detailed pieces of information that would otherwise be quite difficult for one human being to analyze. We use machine learning to be able to make predictions about better decision making. And what we've been able to do, and actually I just came from site today, we've been able to show that for each slab, that where we gave a prediction, which we literally did on Tuesday, we were able to reduce the amount of energy required to heat that slab by about 860 kilowatt hours. That's also the same as 120 grams of carbon dioxide. Now, that's just for one slab. By scaling that up to the rest of their plant, the potential per day, would be a saving of around 11 tons of carbon dioxide and around, if I recall correctly now, around 15 megawatt hours. There is a big opportunity for us to be able to reduce the energy associated with these really critical parts of production that allow us to live in our societies today, but without the unnecessary waste. I'll skip this piece around neural nets. I'm sure I don't have to explain it to you. But that's a bit about us.
Sorry, I just said you do, but you haven't got time.
We are Deep Meta, and this is how we're saving the world 1 ton at a time. We think that there is a very beneficial and fruitful future for the IT and the metals industry. Thank you. I now hand over to Paul.
Thank you. I'll say a little bit about myself first, because I think that's the right thing to do. And Pete set a very good example there. And actually, there's some similarities that should bear in mind. So I started life as a cosmologist, of all things. So leaving from a young age, while I was playing with my ZX81, I had dreams of being a scientist, and I was inspired to go into astronomy. Julie went off to university and worked very hard and got a PhD. And all that time I was working with computers and with data. And I didn't realize at the time I was learning some really useful skills about the right time to be learning them. And I suddenly realized actually probably didn't want to spend my life as an academic. What should I do? And I came down to London, and my first job interview was at a hedge fund, not very far from here. And they said, we really like people with skills with working with data and computers. That'd be really useful. And I went, okay, I'll take a job. I knew nothing about stocks and bonds, but that turned out to be very interesting. But they promptly then explained to me how trading systems work. And I spent another 10, 15 years working at hedge funds, not very far from here. Over time, I started to realize that, well, this was great for my income, but was it really hitting the spot for me? Was it really satisfying me? What was my purpose? And I realized over time I got more and more interested in the technology that I was using, less interested in the finance. So I said, well, okay, these tech startup things seems like a good thing to do. Lots of people are doing that. I think I'll go at doing that. And myself and a Ukrainian colleague of mine, we had lots of bits and pieces lying around, if you like, on our metaphorical workbench, and we've been using for trading. We said, you know what, plug them together a different way. This could be very interesting. And my first startup was an AI-based startup, which was using the same technology, but to look for bad actors within the financial markets. The idea being that if you're an institution and you might be worrying about insider trading or your rogue traders, we had software that would point to someone and the compliance officer would go along and have a little chat with them and find out what they were doing. And that worked really well. We sold that company to NASDAQ in 2017, and I found myself thinking, well, what am I going to do now? How am I going to satisfy that drive for doing something? And about that time, I guess, probably a bit earlier than that, I've always been aware of climate change, and there's a lot of overlap with a lot of the models that you use for modeling climate change with actually astronomy, believe it or not. So I've been following the science for decades, and then slowly got to the point where there was no denying the evidence. Actually, I'll show you a slide. I'll come back to this other one in a minute, but I think this is quite an interesting slide. I nicked this from one of my guys on my team. He showed this to me for his own talk, and I said, "Oh, I'm pinching that slide." This here is a plot of temperature rising over just recent years. It's a pretty convincing straight line, and this green line is what the politicians would tell us we're going to do now to meet the Paris Agreement. I don't know about you, but that's looking a bit implausible right now. It's like we're talking about almost like a 90-degree turn in the trend. Yes, we're doing a great job of talking about fixing the planet, but not actually doing enough. So, this chart wasn't around when I started, but this is sort of evidence that inspired me to actually, you know what, I'm not going to wait for someone else to fix things. I'm going to try and do something. Pretty much along the lines of what Pete was saying. It's like, so what can I do? I've got those skills from finance. I've been working with AI, and surely, what good's that for the climate? So I started studying and retraining. And as part of that, I joined a program based in Cambridge, which is called Carbon 13, which is what they call like a venture builder. It's like a speed dating for other co-founders. I met a couple of people that were kind of soulmates. I'll go back to the start of the story now. My two co-founders, Natalia and Tom. Natalia's background was she's worked a lot in business development for law firms, and Tom has worked a lot in financial technology. We all turned up on this program and said, no, the same thing. We knew we wanted to do something. We weren't sure what we were going to do. And we met Pete in a garden party in the college there, weren't they? And you said to us, you guys seem quite clever. I'm sure you're going to do something good. Have you got any idea what you might do? And what we ended up doing was actually founding an insurance company, which seems a bit odd, really. You think, well, how's insurance going to fix the climate? So I'll tell you how we got to that. As part of the Carbon 13 program, we talked to lots and lots of startups, lots and lots of climate techs, which had the same feeling that they're going to do something. And we were engineers, technologists from all sorts of areas, amazing technologies. And we kept on saying, well, so what's blocking you from getting finance? What's stopping you from going to the bank to get a loan, to do more? What is it your buyers of your products? What is the buyers of the carbon credits you're producing? What are their problems? And we kept coming back to risk. They kept on saying, well, we can't get very good finance rates. We can't get a loan. There's no insurance available for these risks. Our buyers are saying, well, we'd like to buy your product, but we're not going to put money down to buy your product today when it's not going to arrive for 5 years. What happens if you don't exist? What reassurance can you give us? And we kept on thinking, okay, now we recognize this problem. This is a risk transfer problem. You just come up with a model, you compute what the risks are, and you can start to create products to take that risk away. Now, at the same time, we had a conversation with the insurance industry. Said, why aren't you insuring these guys? This is a big industry. It's really important for the planet. Here's some charts about what the industry is going to grow to. It's going to be, times 10 in just a few years. You guys should be insuring. And they were going, yeah, we like the idea, but there's no data. We've never done insurance before for carbon removals. If we have no claims data, we can't price our insurance. And we're going, oh, come on, this is a solvable problem. We'll look for proxies for risk. We'll compute the risks and we'll price. And they were going, could you do it? We said, right, we're going to do it. And that's what we did. We started about a year or so ago, coming out of COVID, we said, okay, what does it take to become an insurance company? And we went back to square one and we learned all the details. the first step is having a convincing risk model. So I got out my Python code. I started getting data from the internet and started building a risk model. And we pounded the streets. We talked to lots and lots of people and trying to find out what their risks were. And what we settled on was for the first product, and I'm going to spare you too much of the spiel, but what we settled on for the first product is delivery risk, because an awful lot of all the climate tech industry are pretty much desperately get funding now to build stuff. We're all about building stuff. But in order to build stuff takes capital, and where's that capital come from? Well, sometimes it will come from investors, ones that are willing to take a punt, but mostly it has to come from the buyers of these credits. So we're talking about big industries like steel, for example. They've got major carbon footprints, and there's only so much they can do to reduce emissions. They really need to do that. Let's just be clear. Emission reduction is most important. But when they can't reduce them all, what do? Well, they turn to someone else to do the reductions for them, and that's what pretty much carbon removal is all about. There is a whole wealth of different technologies and startups. I could talk for hours about all the amazing things we talk about. You talk about rainforest and desert, there are definitely people doing algal farms. If you've seen these now, where they take a piece of desert, they make a very large pool of shallow water and they grow algae in it. And then the algae basically grows, and then they bury the algae under the sand. And that's captured carbon. That's really quite clever. There'll be people growing seaweed. There'll be people doing biochar, which is something I'll talk about in a second. Lots of people growing forests, mangroves, direct air capture, and then pumping it down under the ground in Iceland. Literally, there's so many technologies out there, but they share a lot of common risks. And one of the ones they share is what we call delivery risk. So they go about some activity, they'll sell their credits in advance, and then to someone like Microsoft or British Airways or whoever it might be, and they have to deliver those carbon credits 5 years, 10 years on. The buyers say, "Great, here's my money, but I want definitely. I've got my net zero goals. I'm now committed to. What happens if your carbon doesn't arrive?" And that's what our first product does. Is if it creates delivery. What we say is that for a small extra amount of money on your carbon credits, we're going to guarantee this now, and if it doesn't work out, we'll step in to effectively make it good. And that might be cash, but more likely it's going to be actually alternative carbon credits we store somewhere else. Okay, that's enough about the business model. Let me talk a bit more about the technology, because that's the interesting bit. So, wait for the lag. Well, one last thing about the business model, because I think it's quite important to bear in mind. So, you've got your carbon solution people that are offering these fixes. 5 minutes, that's not enough. Can I have more? And the buyers, but what you need is someone else that works. This is where Okita sits, and you've got the large, the AAA institutions have got trillions of dollars that are used to insuring all sorts of industries. You name it, they insure it. We've got a long centuries and centuries history of insuring. These are the ones with the risk capital to back the policies. So if one of these projects fail, the Okita policy needs to pay out. These are the people that pay out, and so they have to trust our risk models. And these people have to trust our product will pay out. And we sit in the middle. So our risk models are really quite important. I say this because just saying the point is, if you think Okita faces two different markets, we face a very new, nascent, developing market, which everyone's still figuring out, and a very old market, which is quite conservative and needs to understand our predictable numbers for them to actually be able to put large amounts of capital. And it's all about connecting that large amounts of capital, fixing these problems. So, okay, I'm going to spin on. We don't want to hear about this is not business. So, what do we actually do? Okay, this is when we start talking about technology. So, this is some of the early risk models that we looked at. So, this is actually a carbon removal project, which is great. A simple piece. It's actually in Scotland. This project, and they're replanting forests. It's quite a small plot. It's not going to be a gigaton rainforest, but it's a landowner who wants to make a difference. And they've started planting forests. Unfortunately, this forest actually has some ash dieback, so they actually suffered a loss. So this would be an example when we would pay out insurance. So what this fancy graphic is trying to show to you is that when we think about a success of carbon removal, success of this reduction in our footprint, there's a load of very familiar factors which you see probably in any financial professional's desk somewhere. We think about the risk of the transaction. We think about the credit risk of the parties. We think about the regulatory framework. There's all these things that are captured and computed and built into a pricing. Okay, a lot of that's not so interesting, but where things gets quite exciting and interesting is when we start using remote sensing. A lot of these projects are in very remote areas of the world, rainforests, mangroves in Pakistan. These are ones where it's not easy to send out a chat with a hard hat and a clipboard and check it things. And this is when we start using satellite technology. So a lot of what we do, and again, I'm going to skip on it. Let's just go to here. Here we go. There's a couple of slides. Here, this is actually the river delta in Pakistan. So it's a false color plot, and what we're showing here is over the space of a decade, effectively the what we call the regreening. So these are all basically mud flats which mangroves have been planted in, and these are all growing. And this is now we're talking about moving the needle. These are big projects. Guess what? They can't get insurance. When you talk to a normal insurance provider, Pakistan, they go, "Ooh, Pakistan. Oh, I don't know about that." Thing is, these projects we can verify them on the ground. We can check the paperwork. We know that they're actually happening. They should be insured. And this is all Workita does. It's not too difficult. But talk about innovation. Innovation is always solving a new problem. Sometimes it can be actually taking solutions from somewhere else and putting them together in a different way. And that's all we've done. We've taken a lot of technologies and techniques that we use elsewhere in finance. We've plugged them together to have an impact. Have I got a minute left to wrap up? Yeah. Okay. Very quickly, another very interesting one. This is the biochar plant I mentioned earlier in Oregon. Great big piles of sawdust are coming out of sawmills. They're baking it, turn it into carbon granules, which then goes into soil, which boosts soil productivity. Amazing. Electricity comes out as well. This project, we should be doing more of these. Again, can't get insurance. It's ridiculous. Fine. So I'll just wrap up very quickly. I'm going to talk about all the opportunities. Oh God, I could talk for hours on this stuff. You can see how excited I get. The last challenge for us is paperwork. So much of this stuff is in unstructured data. It's in long project documents describing all the intimate details of how they're going to do the forestry or how they're going to plant their mangroves. In order to build risk models, we've got to extract all that information. I got literally like 40,000 pages of PDFs. This is a very topical problem. We talk about using AI, and this is something we're working on right now. It's actually trying to automate this process. An underwriter shouldn't have to read 100 pages of document in order to be able to say to the client, yes, you're insurable or not. So one of the things I'm working on right now is using AI to try and extract that information and structure it. I think that's enough from me, but hopefully I've given you a quick flavor into what insurance, how it could have impact, and all the interesting sort of use of technology behind the scenes. I'll hand over to Richard, which I'm sure can do a much more coherent job of telling us about innovation. Thank you.
I'd be fascinated by that, and I'm not sure I can add much, so I'll keep this quite short actually, because I think they've said everything. So a little bit about my background, career soldier, and 36 years in the army originally, and ended up as chief of defence people. So, if you like, the global HR director for all of defence, with about 3.5 million people that I was responsible for in one way or another. I was coming to the end of my time, and I'd sat on the executive committee of defence for 4 years, and the words climate change and sustainability hadn't been mentioned once in that 4 years. And I turned around and said, I think you're not really taking climate change seriously. And I said, look, my successor's been appointed. We know who it is. I'll go early if you allow him and let him in, because everybody likes a new fresh brew. Get rid of the old guy. He's had it. I'll go a little bit early if you allow me to do a study on climate change, because you're just not taking it seriously. And they eventually, after saying no, we're exempt to climate change, which is an interesting sort of approach to life, I said, yeah, okay. And so I took it on to do a study. I eventually ended up doing a study which wasn't published in December. It wasn't published because I told the Secretary of State quite how much he should be spending on climate change in an ideal world, which he didn't like. And I told him what I thought of it, which he equally didn't like. And so actually in the end, it wasn't published, although it went to the Prime Minister. But what was published was the government response. And that's now on the web. And the government response was basically my report, which was about 600 pages down into 20 pages of glossy. And it makes quite good reading, but it's sort of what I came up with. And what I came up with was looking at climate change from a defence perspective. So when the army wanted to put in some solar panels and some solar farms, they went to the finance director, and this is the same in almost any company I would suggest. They went to the finance director and said, "We'd like to put in some solar farms, please." And the finance director said, "Why?" And they said, "Well, it's really straightforward. We're going to save the planet and save emissions." And the finance director said, "That's not our purpose." The answer is no. Go away. Our purpose is to save the nation, not save the planet. And we will protect the nation and we'll protect its citizens. We won't protect the planet if it comes as a consequence. Great, but if it's not, the answer is no. And they came to me slightly worried and said, "What do I do? We want to put in 76 solar farms. It's going to cost us 270 million, and we've got all these plans, but the finance director's saying no." And I said, "Well, you silly people." I was quite happy to call the army silly at that stage because I was senior enough to do so. I said, "No, there are two reasons why you would want solar farms. The first reason is resilience. It's really straightforward. The government has predicted we're going to run out of electricity in this country by 2035 unless we build and build and build and build green energy. And so it would be a little bit embarrassing if the army, the people of last resort, can't get out of barracks because they haven't got any electricity, because the grid has gone down or they've just run out. More importantly, actually, than that is the fact that one of the things with information technology and one of the things with everything going electric is you immediately become really subject to cyber warfare. And you should be in no doubt at all the amount of cyber attacks that we are under in this country all the time from Russia, day in, day out. If they got to our national grid, if they got to our critical national infrastructure, and I don't know whether you heard Lindy Cameron this morning talking about that this morning on the Today programme, if they got to that, actually they could bring down an awful lot of this country really quickly. And again, it would be really, really embarrassing if the army couldn't get out of barracks to go and solve some of these problems because they didn't have their own source of electricity. 20 years ago, that wasn't even an option. Now it's an option because the technology exists. So why wouldn't you do it for resilience? As a second reason, which is actually even more compelling to the finance director, is in the long run it saves money. So why wouldn't you do it if it saves money? So I told the army that. They went back to the finance director and got 270 million, just like that. It's about understanding why people want to do things, not the fact. And emissions, yeah, okay, great. Actually, it saves lots of emissions. But that isn't the primary focus. And so I looked at it from an army perspective, and I came up with three basic ambitions for the army, or for defence as a whole. The first is to consider that climate change will have an effect on our national security. And I was talking to a parliamentarian today, and he wants to put a piece into the papers about this. National security comes in sort of five elements. Energy, we've seen that really clearly from Russia. Putin's weaponized energy in a really quite fundamental way, in that he's attacked energy centers. He happens to have taken the Donbass, which is where most of the critical minerals and rare earths that are in Europe happen to be sitting. I don't think that's a coincidence. And then Nord Stream 2 happened, and he's cut off gas to Europe. He has weaponized energy as best he can. That would have been catastrophic to us, and will continue to be catastrophic and give us lots of high prices, which is a problem for us, unless we can find an alternative. And the alternative is, funnily enough, green energy, because then it becomes our energy we're providing. And whether it's us, UK, or us and Norway and the Scandinavian countries, it's worth knowing about. So there's an energy piece, there's a water piece, there's a food piece, there's a personal security piece in terms of people being flooded out of their homes. But there's also, and it's a very political topic, of course, there's a border security piece. And we should be alive to the fact that the IPCC sixth report turned around and said, do you know what? The best place in the world to live, in a world of 2 degrees, a world of 4 degrees, is Northern Europe. It's Scandinavia and it's Britain. Scotland, particularly. So if the IPCC said that, I'm quite sure some people will have recognised that. If they're forced out of their region, and Al Gore talks about, so Vice President Al Gore and the World Bank talk about 1 billion climate refugees by the end of this century. If you think about that, and the UN says that 10% move from their region, okay, 10% of 1 billion is what? 100 million. 100 million moving from their region. How many will come to Britain? Even if it's 2 million, even if it's 1 million, it's over a very short period of time, and it utterly overwhelms us. And I'm a massive fan of migration, massive fan of migration. I think it's the right thing to do. But 1 million migrants in a relatively short time, we need to understand what that means. We need to understand what we would do about that, because it would destabilise us, I would suggest. And every country feels the same. So there's a bit about national security. There's a bit about adapting us to fight and win in a climate changed world. The world is changing, whether we like it or not. We can't just ignore it. We can't put our head in the sand. So how do we fight and win in that environment? How does the soldier or the sailor go out to fight and win? There's a good example from the Navy, which is that the scientists told me that the surface sea temperature in the Gulf in the summer, in about 15 years' time, will be about 40 degrees. Surface sea temperature. What do all naval ships use to cool their engines? Surface seawater. So instead of being a nice coolant, which will keep the engines going, it acts as a thermal blanket and the engines cut out. That is a security issue if our frigates can't go into the Gulf at such a point in time. It's also a security issue if the Russians, who are building double hulls on their frigates and destroyers so that they can go into the Arctic as the ice is melting, and we can't because ours are incredibly thin to be really, really efficient, and we get stopped by the ice. So we cede that water, or nearly water, to the Russians and to the Chinese, because they're also building double hulls. And so the Arctic ceases to become a place where we can operate, and yet they can operate. That's a national security issue. That's an issue where actually the freedom of the seas, which the Royal Navy has been going on about boringly for about 500 years, the freedom of the seas becomes something important. And we should be aware of it. So we need to be able to adapt our equipment to be able to deal with that. We need to be able to adapt our people to be able to work in 50 to 55 degrees, which I've fought in, and it's not very pleasant, I can assure you. The third one then, the third ambition was about reducing emissions. And here it's actually, it's sort of more, yes, there's a bit about reducing emissions. That is the right thing to do. But actually it's more about opportunity. It's more about what can we do to build our capability, make it better by adopting some of the technologies that you've heard about today and some of the technologies that are coming along as a result of climate change. So the military are looking at, so I'll take one very simple example, which is we can't have an electric tank. So a tank is 70 tons, Western European tanks, American tanks, they're about 70 tons. There is no green energy that will give you 300 miles in -20 and be refueled in 7 minutes. That's what diesel does for us. There is no green energy that will do that. So we need to think alternatively. We're not going to create electric tanks for the moment. But if you put an electric hybrid engine into a lot of our armoured vehicles, small armoured vehicles, you get an electric capability, which for anybody who has an electric car, well, they'll tell you what a fantastic thing it is to drive on electric. It's far faster, it's far easier to manoeuvre, and an electric drive on each wheel will give you far better capability. If you go down that route, but you still have the backup of a diesel, you get the best of both worlds. Why wouldn't we do that? And that, in fact, is what the Army is doing. And it's moving a number of its vehicles to hybrid, so it can go completely silent for a number of hours, so it can sneak up on the enemy, and also it can get places because it has a diesel engine as well. It's thinking laterally. It's thinking about how we can use this to our advantage, which I think is really good. So I suppose I would turn around to you and say that soldiers actually, I think, are quite good at this because we end up being what I would call a pragmatic optimist. So we have to be optimistic. For anybody who's been a soldier on operations, if you have to get out of the front gate when you know that there's a chance of you being killed, as you go out the front gate of Iraq or Afghanistan or Northern Ireland, which I did a lot of as a youngster, then actually you have an absolute confident belief it's not going to happen to you. Otherwise you wouldn't go out. So we end up being optimists, but we end up being pragmatic optimists because we have to make sure that it isn't us by doing stuff and making it work. So we end up being pragmatic optimists, and that's what you need in this climate changed world. And that's what actually leads to innovation. Now, I'm not a doom and gloom merchant. I happen to think that we will be able to innovate our way out of this problem. And I rather pompously at one stage was describing myself as an anti-Malthusian. So Malthus was a 18th century philosopher who said that as a result of the Industrial Revolution, we will run out of food in this world with 2 billion people in it. We've got 8 billion people in the world today, and we haven't run out of food. In fact, there are more people being fed better throughout the world than ever before. So Malthus was fundamentally wrong. Why was he wrong? There's a very, very simple answer to that. Because we uniquely in the animal kingdom innovate our way out of problems. And we innovate our way in completely weird ways, but we innovate our way. And I want to give you 2 examples of sort of innovation, really, which come from the military. The first is the sort of genius innovator, the person who comes up with a really brilliant idea. There aren't actually that many of those, but there are a few. And there was a genius innovator who thought up the idea of a tank in the First World War. Okay, try and break down the trenches and try and sort of sort something, and they came up with this idea of a tank. Absolute genius idea. It was presented to the army, and the army said, "No way, we're having nothing to do with this. Our horses are far better than tanks." So actually, the very first tank, and you can see it in the Tank Museum, is called Her Majesty's Land Ship, and has a name, because the Navy took it on, not the army. But there was a genius who decided to try and create something that would break the deadlock in the First World War in the Western Front. And interestingly, I don't know whether you've seen the film All Quiet on the Western Front. What you get there is the Germans terrified of these tanks as they went across, because they were genuinely innovative. And by 1917, 1918, we were using them in an extraordinary way, which actually, in the end, won the war for us. Not all down to the tank, but tanks were quite a large part of it, the innovation that went into it. So that's one idea, a genius. They're few and far between. Far more common is the coincidence of ideas. And Paul sort of mentioned this, the idea, 2 things coming together. So let me give you another example from the First World War, which was a number of our ships had aircraft on them, and they'd be catapulted, they went onto the sea, they flew off, they came back on the sea, and then they were catapulted back onto the ship. So the idea of flying from the water was not new. The idea of flying was not new. The idea of ships was not new. But what was brand new was creating a landing deck on a ship. It's now called an aircraft carrier. That was completely new. That was utterly innovative. And in the First World War, we had more aircraft carriers than anybody else by the end of the First World War, because it was our idea. It was just a brilliant idea. And it allows me to give you my favourite factoid, which is that the number of people who crewed HMS Victory, for those who've seen it, Nelson's flagship in the Battle of Trafalgar, is exactly the same as the number of people who crew HMS Queen Elizabeth, which is our brand new aircraft carrier, the most sophisticated aircraft carrier in the world. It's exactly the same, 850. That says something about innovation. Because if you've seen HMS Queen Elizabeth, you could fit about 40 Victories in it. That's innovation. So, really, really important. But why is it important? I will give you one reason, which I hope will resonate. I think we need to innovate our way out of this. If you look at what happened during lockdown, and regardless of whether you think lockdown was a good idea or not, and the general consensus I think now is that it was not very good for us in the end, but regardless of whether you think it was a good idea or not, in lockdown, we crashed the Western world economy, and we saved 7% of emissions. So behaviour alone is not going to get us there. If we ask people to stop eating meat, 90% of people will ignore us. If you ask people not to drive somewhere, 90% of people will ignore us. So being the doom and gloomsters saying you've got to stop everything you do and we will have a better world just doesn't work with human behaviour. And we've proved that during lockdown. So actually, what we've got to do is incentivize them to have a better world and incentivize them to do something different. And that's why, for example, the electric car is so interesting, because actually what we're doing there is we're incentivizing people through whatever mechanism. It costs me 10 quid to fill up my car, and I can go 330 miles in it. You know, that's a little bit cheaper than petrol. I'm incentivized to do that. By the way, it also changes the way I drive, because apart from when I really want to show off, I actually drive a little bit slower to save electricity. When I want to show off, I can beat any other car on the road with my car. But that's because I like showing off. But I don't do it that often because it uses up quite a lot of electricity. So there's a piece here about actually you find electric car drivers tend to be slightly more sensible. William Hague, I don't know whether any of you have heard William Hague, Lord William Hague, supposedly the best Conservative Prime Minister we never had. He now talks about a changing dynamic in the world. And he talks about 10 points, and I'm not going to go through all 10 points, but his 10th point, he said the real optimism here is that we are going to see, this is his prediction, an increase in state-sponsored innovation. But state-sponsored innovation is not enough. We're going to, if we as a country want to be as great as we want to be, if we want to be at the forefront of what we're doing, then actually we have to innovate our way to that. We can't rely on where we have been. And so what William Hague's saying is state-sponsored innovation. What I would say is that's not ever going to be enough. What we need is innovation from everybody in order, or as many people as we can, and use private funds in order to be able to do it. And that's what Climate VC tries to do. So I'll finish. I want to congratulate you, actually, because you have stolen a market which is just extraordinary. When people say information technology, they don't know what it means, because it means so many different things. But what they do know is information technologists always are the first into innovation. You've actually created a law, Moore's law, which says that you're going to be exponentially innovating all your life. So actually, innovation to you is something that is really, really second nature, and everybody knows you for it, which is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. But I would argue it comes with a responsibility. For being known as the technologists who innovate, and that's what information technology is all about. That's why so many people are really interested in trying to get into the tech world through innovation. By being known for that, and by being really good at that, and by having your own law about that, actually there's a responsibility to use that to the best of our ability. Not only to make an awful lot of money, and I never have any problem with anybody making an awful lot of money if that's where they want to go, but actually for trying to do the right thing for the world as well, as a byproduct. And for me, that's how I've tried to approach defence. If I can get their emissions down to net zero, which is I said that we could do by 2050, that's great. But if I can get their capability to be the best army in the world, and the best navy and the best air force in the world, and the greenest, that's even better. And that's what you do so well. So I'll stop there, but I just wanted to say thank you for what you do, because actually I think you're a shining light for others to try and follow. But please use it responsibly.